So good morning. Welcome to the first workshop of the day in this room. It's on the adoption process. We have with us today Carla Crane with the Department of Human Services, and she'll introduce herself and take it from here. Let's welcome her.
Okay, thanks everybody. So my name is Carla Crane, and I work in the adoption program in Salem. And I am currently a manager in the program. And prior to that, I worked in the field in different positions, including starting as a caseworker and working as a supervisor. And so I've had some different perspectives. And so I've actually only been with the program in central office for a couple of years, but it's been a great time of change. And that's a little bit about what I'm here to talk to you about today, is some of the changes that have occurred in terms of the adoption process and where we're going. In the future, hopefully this is becoming a little bit more of a transparent process with some of the changes that have happened, as well as this is a great opportunity to really explain what I know can seem like a very complicated process and very confusing to folks. So I'm going to go ahead and go through a slideshow here. If there are questions, I think it'd probably be best to wait till the end just to help it move along. We have about an hour, I understand. And then I also have some handouts for you guys at the end that really will give you more detail around what to look for with adoption planning. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, understanding DHS policies, programs, the adoption process. In about 2010, when I came into the program, there was a huge undertaking going on to really review and revise many of the adoption program rules. They hadn't been revised for quite some time, but there had been a lot of input and different committees and reviews done by folks both from field, community partners, as well as national experts around the adoption program. And there was some good feedback about some things that were really working well, as well as some ideas about different changes that could happen. And so as a result, this is a list. I won't run through all of them, but of all of the different policies that we worked on and that were revised in 2010, and then there was some subsequent revisions after they were released to incorporate different feedback. We still have about almost as many rules and policies that we're working on that will also be released, that really the idea is to help clarify and simplify some of the information. And we did actually combine, believe it or not, I think there were actually more. We've actually combined some to have fewer. The two main rule sets that I'm going to talk about today are identification and consideration of potential adoptive resources, and the adoption placement selection. So that's really, how do we identify these families that we're bringing forward? What do we do to recruit them? And then how is that final decision made? Those are a couple of areas in which there have been a lot of changes in the last couple of years. And again, these changes were first introduced in about July of 2010. There were different revisions that happened, and then they were updated in September of 2011. So pretty recent. There were some different themes. When we went to undergo the revision of the rules, we were really looking at having some different themes flow through the different rule sets. So I'll talk a little bit about those. And this came again from different input that we received from people outside of the agency as well as within the agency about what was important and what we wanted to have incorporated. There we go. The first one is, of course, consideration of children's current and lifelong needs. So it seemed that we were doing a fairly good job on really looking at current needs, what's happening right now with the child. But what we really wanted to look at is what are those long-term, and really think about, as we're making adoptive placements and selections, what do children need long-term? And so not just focusing on the here and now, and that attachment piece is extremely important, but also long-term, what are some of the issues adoptive children struggle with, and making sure the families are really equipped and have the understanding of what the challenges can be as children get older, especially when they have special needs and separated from family. And then, of course, one of the major pieces we wanted to really look at is that prioritization of relatives and placement with siblings. And this was a huge shift in our policy in that we really were looking at a change in preference to really have relatives be the primary preference. And then after that, we would look at other placements. But that really goes back to that whole piece around Current and lifelong needs. Current can be really important. You may be placed with a foster family. But lifelong, what we've really seen with children as they get older is they often seek out those relationships. That's really important to them. And so the more we can do to make that happen at the beginning, to either solidify through placement or just through connections, making sure that they're really connected with their family and that the family is really the one who's helping to make the decision around the placement. Early, inclusive, and ongoing planning. And again, this goes back to thinking about it at the beginning, trying to move things a little quicker so we don't wait till the end. Really trying to figure out at the beginning, who is this placement resource? If this doesn't work out, who might it be? And as I'm sure you all have seen, earlier planning can help, and more inclusive planning with relatives and partners can really help to lead to better outcomes. And as we moved, and I'll talk about it a little later, but in our committee process to be more inclusive in who we brought to the table to help make these decisions around adoption planning, the net kind of got wider, who all these people were who were giving recommendations. So at the end, we did have to retain the decision-making for that final plan by the department in terms of that final placement. So we'll talk about that, and that'll make a little more sense, I think, as we go through this. The major kind of fundamental change that led to many of the other changes is the expansion of the relative definition. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. DHS really had more of a restrictive definition, and we expanded it greatly in 2010 to incorporate a different and broader understanding of who could be relatives, and really trying to, again, look to the family to identify those relatives. So there's a couple different categories. There's the A through C relative. In the definition, there's different categories. So this is just a summary. But in the A through C part of the definition, there are blood and legal relatives, relatives based on the custom of the tribe, defined by refugee policy, step-parents, siblings, adoptive parents, all of these people who have some sort of legal or biological or adoptive marriage connection to the kids. And then there is the relative Ds. That's what we often say, the relative D. And that would be an individual who the family or child identifies as a relative when the individual had an emotionally significant relationship with the child, young adult, or family prior to the placement in substitute care. So really, these individuals are people that the family looks to, and there is no legal or biological connection, but it's somebody that the family says, you know, this is really my relative. This is who we consider important. This is our aunt. This is like our grandma. It's Nana. And that we could consider those people as well. And so this really, can be unique in some states that we went this broad, with the relative definition. But in doing so, we also wanted to ensure that we maintained an order of preference. And this is one of the pieces where we first put out the rules, and then there was a lot of feedback, and there were some changes made. So this is where we are today. And relatives A through C, again, those are those legal, blood, relatives, adoption, marriage. That's the priority preference. So when caseworkers are making decisions and looking at, okay, who is going to be brought forward for a final selection, it's really those relatives A through C. Then, second preference, if there are no relatives A through C, would be relatives D. Those are those members of the family who maybe don't have that legal connection but are recognized by the family as being a relative. And the important piece around that is they did need to have a relationship with the child prior to coming into care or with the family. So these would be people who the family or the child had some sort of relationship with. And then along with relative D is where you can consider a current caretaker. And of course, the current caretaker is that foster parent who doesn't have any relationship prior. They became the placement resource, developed a relationship. Now it's been a certain amount of time, and they want to be considered. They can be considered, but only after the relatives A through C. So we really want to do that good ongoing and early planning to make sure we figure out the relatives as soon as possible. Because we all know that can be really hard when we have kids who are in a placement for a long period of time. And then we look at a relative showing up who's an A through C and they have priority. So we really need to try to figure out this relative piece as early as possible. Third, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is it something that you feel like You can go ahead and ask it. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering how rigid is this order of preference?
Okay, that's a really great question. So it's very rigid. And I'll be really honest, it's because otherwise we'll end up, I think, where we were before, which was with a lot of placements that we were removing a lot of children from family who maybe could have been with family. But when you have the focus not on the family, if you don't give them that priority preference, then we're really going against both the federal requirements to look at placement with relatives. We're really going against what the agency espouses of returning children to family. So that's the reason it's so rigid. But that's also a reason why we really want people to focus early on, so we can be more focused on getting this figured out and not wait until long term when it becomes really difficult for everybody. The C is a current caretaker. So with the foster parent who is granted, let's say, current caretaker status, there's a decision that's made. Will they go alone or with a relative D, if there is a relative D? Or would they go to committee selection with others? And that would be other general recruited families. And so that would be the third if they end up going with others. And then
what's the current cutoff for someone who's considered a current caretaker?
I'm going to talk about that in just a sec. And then general applicants. So number 4 is general applicants. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the changes to the current caretaker process here in a sec. Go ahead.
I don't know if it's appropriate to ask this now, but in number 1,
Uh-huh.
if the relatives who are available have no relationship with the child at all, maybe the child is 10 and has never seen these relatives, do you still put the relatives ahead?
We
of
do,
everybody
and the
else?
idea is that if you figure this out at the very beginning, okay, and you know who these relatives are, if they're interested in being a resource, that you really work to cultivate that relationship. Of course, you want to make sure that the relative is safe and appropriate, and it's not just any relative that's out there. That's for consideration. So they're going to be considered. We're going to look at them. It doesn't always mean they're going to be the placement resource. I mean, there's all kinds of questions there that you have to look at in terms of the assessment. There's lots of questions going on, so not sure.
How often and at what age do you let the child say, I don't want relative A through C, I want, my current caretaker?
So the child has to consent. Of course, I think it's age 14, and we really look at that more at age 12 because of the process in terms of how long it can take to finalize. But we ask for their input, and often that input comes through the attorney. Depending, it may come through the child themselves. It really depends on the age and the developmental level. But we don't want to put that final decision, obviously, on a child. The decision really needs to rest with the department and following input from others.
There are a lot of questions, and I'm not sure that you would like the questions now or to the end.
How about we run through this, because it may answer some of yours, and then I'll leave a little bit of time at the end. Okay? Come on. Okay, a current caretaker. So the question is, of course, when does a foster parent, when can they request consideration as a current caretaker, and when would the department consider that? First of all, the child's permanent or concurrent plan must be adoption. The department must have determined it's in the best interest to begin identifying adoptive resources. So we have those cases where we're still working a return home plan pretty strongly. We feel that might happen. At that point, we're not going to go and say, yes, let's proceed with the current caretaker. The foster parent has had the child in their home, or at least one child in a sibling group being placed together. So one of the kids in that sibling group or the child, has to have been in the home for 12 consecutive months. The caseworker and the supervisor have conducted a thorough relative search in accordance with the rules. So they've really looked out there and made sure there aren't any relatives A through C, essentially, before we go to make a consideration of whether or not to consider this foster parent as a current caretaker. And there are no current actions to identify or assess a relative A through C. So we're not still in the process of trying to figure out if there's relatives or study one of the relatives. And of course, in line with keeping siblings together, the foster parent's willing to be considered as the adoptive resource for the child's sibling when the plan is to place the sibling together in the same home. And the current caretaker process. So it's not automatic. they've had the child in the home 12 months, it doesn't automatically mean that this is going to be a current caretaker. What it means is they can request to go to a committee and have a child welfare manager or their designee make a final decision about whether or not this foster parent will be considered as a current caretaker. Because, of course, that current caretaker gives them a special status. They're not going to have to necessarily go against other general recruited people. They may just be the final selection in the end. So the permanency committee so essentially what happens is the caseworker will request a permanency committee. And then the permanency committee is a group of individuals. It involves the caseworker. It involves different people, such as the child's attorney, the CASA. We've really expanded who's part of this current caretaker in the permanency committee process. But in the end, it's that child welfare manager or somebody they designate who makes the final decision. And that person decides whether to consider, meaning proceed to final selection, the current caretaker alone, or if there's a relative D, they would always go with a relative D, or along with other general applicants. So they might think, this is a strong resource, but I'm not sure this is the best resource for this child, so let's open up the pool. And the permanency committee. There were some changes to the permanency committee, and again, this goes back to that value of really trying to be more inclusive and allow for more input and transparency in the process. And so the permanency committee now consists of 2 individuals who have no current personal or professional relationship to the child. One of them has to facilitate, make sure the rules are followed, and kind of set the stage, and that needs to be a DHS staff member. And then the other individual who doesn't have any relationship with the case could be a staff member or it could be a community partner. And then members of the child's team. So the child's team can be pretty broad, but there's specific people who are involved in working with the child who would be on that committee or invited to committee and could participate if they chose. And that would be the caseworker, the child's attorney, the CASA. If the child is an ICWA child, it would be a representative from the tribe. Or if they're a refugee, it would be a representative from the refugee committee. And the committee, what would happen is you'd have the committee. Some of you may be familiar with this process. People come, they talk about the child, they talk about the placement, they talk about what's happening. And then the committee would provide a written recommendation to the child welfare manager, who's also present, or their designee. A lot of the program managers may designate to a supervisor, who, for example, who's very experienced. And that person has to make the final decision within 1 day of receiving those recommendations. So normally by the next day they make a final decision. And I just put this in here because I think this is important, not necessarily because it's specific to adoption, but the only decision at a permanency committee that cannot be designated or delegated down from the child welfare manager is an APLA decision. In all cases where we're moving to APLA or that's being considered, it's always going to be a program manager who makes that decision. Because, of course, we really want to try to have more permanent plans if possible. And then this is somebody's question earlier. How rigid is it? It's pretty rigid. There is and of course we like to say that there is a possibility of having a change to that order of preference around the relatives, current caretaker, whatnot. But it's very, very rare. And the request has to come from the local office. So it starts with the caseworker and the supervisor talking to the program manager. And they really would have to make a determination that it's in the child's best interest. And then that request would go from the program manager to the adoption program manager. And the final decision would rest with the adoption program manager whether or not to change the order of preference. So in other words, whether or not the current caretaker may be considered with, say, the relative A. And they're looking at not just based on time in the home, but some real extraordinary need for the preference to be reconsidered. So somebody asked about maybe an older child who really wants to stay where they are, they have no relationship. That might be a reason. I mean, it really is case dependent. We want to be careful about giving too many examples of possibilities. It really is rare. I don't know that it's happened, to be honest. Often through good case planning, discussion with the family, discussion with the child, you can work these things out without having to get to this level. I think often when the family really understands and the caretaker understands and people are able to come together and make a good decision, we can hopefully avoid having to go a different route where the department's making the decision. So that's what we really are hoping for. The challenging piece here is when, of course, there's a consideration of multiple relatives. And what do we do when we have all these relatives? It's actually fabulous when we have all these relatives who are interested in taking care of a child. We love that, but it can also be really challenging for a caseworker. If the family in particular, when you have different like maternal and paternal relatives, and there may even be siblings who are adopted, you can get into all kinds of relatives who would all fit within that category A through C. So what do we do? What we should be doing is seeking really input and trying to engage those relatives to help facilitate agreement on the potential resource to be considered. So a lot of caseworkers might have a family meeting, they may even do a conference call because you might have family members out of state to really explain what are these child's needs and and try to get the family to understand both what the child's needs are and then help them to identify who's the most appropriate relative to take on permanent placement. And sometimes you have one for temporary placement, one for permanent placement if it's going to be out of state. When agreement cannot be reached, which does happen, in particular in those cases where you have maternal, I think, and paternal, DHS selects up to 3 families. So it could be 1, 2, or 3. And it's done, in accordance with the order of preference. So if you have 3 people, 2 of them are a relative A through C and 1 is a relative D, you're always going to go with the A through Cs, those legal biological relatives. And then when a resource is not approved, so you go to get a home study and then they find out for some reason they don't end up being approved, or they just don't ever finish the paperwork, or they change their mind, the child welfare program manager decides whether DHS will start additional home studies. And they consider both the best interest of the child and the impact on achieving permanency. You could have multiple more relatives out there, for example, who start coming forward, but the question at that point is, how long have we been in this situation with the child in a placement? Does it make sense to start all over? What's the likelihood that these new relatives will be approved? There's a lot of things that have to be weighed. So we want to balance the importance of placing with relatives with the importance of achieving permanency for a child. Oops. Okay. General applicant recruitment. So what is this? This is when we don't have relatives. We don't have foster parents who are considered as current caretaker. We really need to start recruiting and looking for a placement. And some of the requirements around general recruitment include it needs to be timely. You'll hear that a lot around everything with case planning. It needs to be timely. We need to be working on it as soon as we know this is where we're going to be going. It can only happen, again, when there's no relatives being considered. And DHS must conduct recruitment activities, including at a minimum a posting of a waiting child bulletin for 30 days, unless an exception is granted. So what happens is a caseworker realizes, okay, there's nobody out there, the plan's adoption, we're going to have to find a resource. They write up what's called a bulletin. They explain the child's needs. They send it to central office. Central office in the last year has started the OR website. And before we used to have these paper bulletins that people would come in and look through. Now everything's online. So there's a secure password-protected website where families who've been studied through private agencies in Oregon, as well as families who've been studied through DHS, can work with their caseworkers, their adoption workers, and look at these children online. So it's a lot quicker. It's easier to update. We don't have that paper process of going back and forth. And so what would happen is the caseworker would make sure they get onto this website as soon as possible. And they need to be out there for 30 days to make sure people have really had an opportunity to see it and that we've received a good pool of applicants. And so they don't just put it out for necessarily a week and then pull it down. We want to make sure we get a good pool of applicants and people have had an opportunity in order to, again, help make the best decision. Exceptions to general recruitment. We could end up making an exception to the 30-day requirement. This happens more often, for example, with a young baby who you put the posting up for a week or 2 weeks and you've got 100 applications or home studies from families. We may not wait, in that case, 30 days. There may not be a reason to. And the only other time we would have an exception to doing the bulletin process would be when there's a permanency committee held and the program manager determines, or the designee actually, that there's an individual known to the child that should be considered as the resource. So this person could be, for example, a mentor or a teacher, somebody that the child has a relationship with that really appears to be a very strong resource, wants to adopt them, but they're not a current caretaker, they're not a relative D. And so why do we want to open up general recruitment when we have a really strong resource and the child already has a really strong relationship? That's a decision that could be made at a permanency committee, and then they would get a home study, and then there'd be the final decision made. This can also, I point this out because could also be a foster parent who doesn't meet the current caretaker timeline. So if you have a foster parent who's been a foster parent for 10 months, there's no relatives out there, it's an older child, you may not need to wait 12 months for them to meet current caretaker. You could go and have them considered. But this is only, again, after there's no other relatives, current caretakers. Working? There we go. DHS requirements. So what does the caseworker have to do? This is just kind of a summary. They have to make reasonable efforts to identify and place the child with an adoptive resource in a timely manner. Oops, my PowerPoint's doing funny things. Okay. They have to request input about what skills, characteristics, abilities the resource needs in order to best meet the child's needs from professionals who've worked with the child and the child's team. So this is that inclusive planning. The caseworker should be asking, what do you think this child needs from the therapists, from the attorneys, from the CASAs? We want this to be an inclusive process so we get the best information, the most information possible to help make a decision, because this is such a significant decision. And then the caseworker needs to receive and review those home studies, assuming it's general applicant requirement, or general applicant recruitment, they'd receive these different home studies. They need to be reading them and reviewing them in a timely manner as well. And then finally, following consultation with the supervisor, because we don't want necessarily somebody out there just making their own decision without some sort of input and an opportunity for supervision, the caseworker, following that order of preference, would identify the adoptive resources for final consideration. And those would be people who are going to now go to the final selection process. So what are the considerations for you as CRB members? Really asking yourself and of course the caseworker, what are the efforts that have been made to identify, contact, and assess relatives? And this starts right away. This doesn't start when the adoption plan changes, but it starts right away. As soon as that child's in care, we need to start thinking about who are the relatives out there. Because even if it doesn't go to adoption, these can be people who long-term can be a great support to the child and family. The efforts made to assist the family to reach agreement on the potential adoptive resource. So again, if you have multiple relatives, what is that caseworker doing to help that family come to a decision? Are they calling together a family meeting? Are they providing information to these different family members? What are they doing to help really facilitate a decision so that in the end DHS doesn't have to be the one making the decision, that we really can hopefully get the family to make a good decision based on the child's needs? And have they made those requests for adoption home studies for the interested relatives? So if it's an ICPC, we know those can take a long time if they're out of state, so we want to get that going. Some additional considerations. If there are no relatives A through C, what efforts have been made to schedule the permanency committee for the foster parent who's requesting to be a current caretaker? If there's no relatives or current caretaker, what are the efforts they've made to begin general recruitment? In other words, have they gotten photos for the child? Have they written up the bulletin? Have they sent it to central office? And then some of the most difficult to place children we have are those with the highest special needs. And so the caseworker doesn't need to wait until they've done recruitment for a while to start what we call expanded recruitment. There are additional websites. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Heart Gallery. There's just different ways in which a child can be recruited for that will be beyond statewide, nationwide. And so if we know we're going to have a difficult time placing a child or we're concerned about it because of their high needs or their age, we should start that early. So that's one of the things. Often new caseworkers aren't as aware of the process, and so this is a good thing to be aware of, that there are other opportunities out there. And then a good question is, how many home studies have you received? And how many have you read? And how many have you followed up on? Because sometimes caseworkers are so busy, and I know you all know this and hear this, that they have a hard time getting to everything they need to do. So this really does need to be a priority, because those families may back out, they may withdraw, they may get selected for other children. So we want people to be reading these home studies as soon as possible and trying to identify resources as soon as possible. The process. Look at my time here. Just one sec. So now I'm going to talk to you about the actual process. So up to this point, we've just been figuring out who we're going to consider. Now we're going to actually make the decision. And this is one of the pieces that has really changed in policy. Prior to the change in policy, all of the decisions actually went to a committee. And it would be a group of 3 people who aren't involved in the case, who would hear information, and then the committee would make a decision based on majority vote. This changed in 2010. And now we have a couple of different processes. We could have a caseworker selection, and that would be after the caseworker has requested input from the child's team. They've done consultation. They may actually make that final decision for some of those cases that are more simple. For example, if you have one relative or you have a current caretaker and it's clear that this is the one, this needs to be the resource. Those may end up being a caseworker selection. Then we still have a committee process, but again, that committee process has expanded to include more people on the committee. And that final decision is now made by what we call an ADS. That's an Adoption Decision Specialist. And what is an ADS? An ADS is really a person who works for the department who has been approved by the adoption program manager to make the final decision for adoption selection. So this person goes to this committee, they listen, they take notes, and then they don't make the final decision until after the entire committee's over and they've heard all the recommendations from the committee members. And then again, they can make that decision right away, or there's a time period in which they can make that decision, because we want to recognize how significant this can be and how important it can be to take time to process at times. And the ADS committee process, let's see. So we have 2 different levels of committee. We have adoption committees that are scheduled by central office, and we have adoption committees that are scheduled by the local office. The central office committee happens when there's more than one relative, because those can be pretty sensitive, when there's a current caretaker with others, where it's an employee or a DHS conflict of interest applies. For example, somebody like maybe a CASA may decide to go, it may be decided to go to a committee and maybe not be a caseworker selection, or a local selection because you want to remove it from the county where the CASA works. The resource lives outside of the USA. So anytime that we have a case that has to involve international elements, it needs to go to central office, because people on that committee tend to have a little bit more expertise, and those international placements can be really difficult. And then a case that's supposed to go to a lower level committee could actually be bumped up to the higher level central office committee if there's a request. For example, it's a really complex case, or there's some reason the program manager feels that it should go to central office. Those can still go to central office. There's the local office committee. So again, you have the committee, but then you have a final person who works for the department who makes the final decision. And those would be one child with extraordinary needs, one child age 6 or over, siblings when you don't have a relative or current caretaker, when there's general applicant is being considered as a foster parent with other general applicants. So basically when you have a group of general applicants. And again, you could go to a local committee when normally it would be a caseworker selection, but for some reason the caseworker doesn't feel prepared, or the supervisor asks that it go to a committee instead of being a caseworker selection. And the caseworker selection, although Oregon actually has received quite a bit of positive praise for the committee process, because it can be a really good process for vetting and deciding what is that best resource. one of the recommendations we received from national experts was it may not need to happen in every case. That may just actually slow it down because it is such a process. And so that's why we do have the opportunity for caseworker selection. But those cases are the ones where essentially it's a relative alone. You have a current caretaker alone, so they're not being considered with anybody else. Or general applicants for a child under 6 with no extraordinary needs. So if you have a young baby and you get lots of really strong resources, then that could be a caseworker selection as well. And then if there's an Indian child or a refugee child, because really we look to the tribe in those situations to help and make the decision. So the caseworker is just working with the tribe to make the decision. And I'm not going to run through this timeline in detail because it's a lot of information, but I put this up here to show you, and you can always, I understand this will be on the web, you can refer to this later. This is the timeline for the selection, and kind of to give you an idea that it is a process, that really the caseworker is going to ask for input from those different people, the attorney, therapists. They're going to send out copies of the materials before the committee, at least 10 days before the committee, so that the people who are going to be on committee have an opportunity to read that information. The committees, again, can include the CASAs and different people. So then the committee occurs that 10 days after those materials have been sent. And at the conclusion, that ADS makes a decision, and by the next day, the committee makes recommendations, and by the end of the next day, the ADS makes the decision. So you've got some time in there that the caseworker is going to need to prepare for. They're going to need to send out the materials. They're going to need to have it all ready. There's going to need to be this committee, and we want to make sure the process is followed. And it's similar for the caseworker selection. And the piece that's important is even when the caseworker is making the decision, they have a requirement to send out those materials around the home study and information about the child to the child's team, the attorney and the CASA, because those people have an opportunity to provide input. And so we want to make sure the caseworker actually gives them the information in order to provide that input. And then the input needs to come in a couple days before the date at which the final selection is going to be made. And then the caseworker would consult with their supervisor, and then they would make the final selection. So again, that's a process as well. So what are the considerations for the CRB? We really want to ensure that there's an inclusive process that it facilitates a decision resulting from input from resources that know the child. So it's important that the caseworker is being open, submitting the materials that they need to do, asking the good questions. In the end, DHS does have the final responsibility, so oftentimes people aren't happy with the decision for one reason or another, but in the end it is a DHS decision that gets made. And really, I think the important one is not following this process. In other words, not following the timelines, not getting the materials out. It can result in a review. So if a person is considered, who's a relative, let's say, and they're not selected, one of the reasons for central office relooking at that case could be that the process wasn't followed. So that would be, for example, we've had situations where attorneys didn't receive their materials or they weren't notified about committee. So we really want to make sure that caseworkers follow this because it can delay permanency in the end, as well as be really hard for the people who are being considered and the child to wait. And then adoption assistance. The next step in the process after the placement's been selected and the child is free is the adoption assistance process. And this isn't negotiated until the child's free and in that designated placement. It has to be negotiated with the family. It's not just a set amount. The federal regulations require that there be a negotiation and that the agency provide resources, but it's really meant to combine with the family's resources. And it's based on the out-of-pocket expenses. So the family needs to have an opportunity often, especially with general applicants, the child's not placed there until after the selection is made. They need to have some opportunity to really look at their expenses before we do the adoption assistance. That often happens. And then finalizing the plan, following the child being declared legally free, placed in the home, the adoption assistance being opened, the caseworker or the supervising worker sends a final recommendation to central office saying, go ahead, finalize this adoption. And then the department signs the consent to the adoption and coordinates with the attorney for the family to obtain the final adoption decree. So what I have for you, just a sec here. And now this is essentially the end where we have some opportunity for questions. And I also was wondering if you would hand out the handouts now while I take a couple questions. Yeah.
The letter, a long time ago, we would see the relative search letter.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that could stand a lot of improvement. Has that been changed in this process too? For instance, you're asking, would they be a placement for the time the child's in foster care only? Or there are not enough choices.
Okay.
And I don't know that as I read that, and maybe culturally I'm not as educated, I don't realize that's kind of appears to be the one and only shot. And I keep encourages being caseworkers, as the case does or does not progress, to be giving more personal information about that. Is that being looked into?
That's a really good question. What I know is that the letters were being worked on and they were looking at different letters, in particular because the change went from more of a one-time looking at a search at the beginning to an ongoing search. And so I can't give you right now the status update on those letters, but I know part of it was and I'll talk about this in a second, we have a new data system. So the new letters were also going to be part of the new data system. So that's why I say I'm not exactly, just because I haven't been responsible for that piece, I'm not certain. But I do know that it's really good for workers not just to rely on the letters. And so that's another piece. If we have family out there, if we just send a letter, that may not, especially if we're talking about a child who has no relatives that have been identified, that just the letters probably isn't enough, even though that may be all that's required. We really, if we're looking at placing a child adoptively, want to try to make other efforts as well. And sometimes that can mean a phone call or providing more information, like you say. So that's a good point.
Is it correct that a caseworker is to do a relative search once a year? Thank you. After the initial relative search has been established, when the child comes into care, they do a relative search. Excuse me, my mouth's not working. And my understanding is that a year later, another search is also required, and this continues until yearly until something permanent is established with the child. Is that correct?
There is an ongoing search, and I can't remember exactly the specifics around the letters and how that works, but it's no longer a one-time search. We are asking that be relooked at and that the search be ongoing. Yes.
1 second. Here.
As I sit on the CRB and look at adoptive, situations, often my question is, why is this taking so long? And so what I want is a realistic time frame.
Yeah. So, and that's a perfect segue into actually this handout that's going out. Has everybody received it? Okay. So, sure I have the same one you guys have. This is a process. I think one of the things that's really important about adoption is it's kind of that area where social work and the legal field really do come together, because we have to make sure everything is really done legally correct according to the law. We don't want any issues there, and there's a lot of paperwork required. And so what I've handed out to you all is a different, it's really the different critical junctures in the case around adoption and what's required. And so one of the things that may be helpful as you're on CRB is to think about, what is the worker, at what point are they? Are they in the process where they're just starting recruitment, or are they in the process where adoption assistance is done? And what's left to do? And so the cases don't necessarily follow sequentially, so it's really hard to say what takes so long in each specific case. Sometimes a child is free and not placed. Sometimes a child's been placed for adoption, but the family is having struggles and they're not ready to finalize. Sometimes the ones that probably take the longest are those that get appealed, that go to TPR and they get appealed. I mean, those can take for a really long time. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to really make the process as simple as we can. We have actually removed some of the required forms. And on the back of this, if everybody will refer to the back of this, where there's a kind of a flow chart here. I know you've all probably heard about the ORCID system. The ORCID is our new data system. And on the one hand, it's been a challenge for staff because they've found that they have to really input more information than they had to before. But on the other hand, it has some really good features as people are learning how to use it. And one of those is it's very transparent to caseworkers what needs to be in central office. So they don't need to be emailing and asking. It says right on a page, this is everything that's still outstanding. And I think one of the things that can be really helpful in moving it along is often, I see this, caseworkers go and say, I don't know what's taking so long. They should be able to ask that information or look in the ORCID system and be really clear about what's still outstanding and what needs to happen. And so that's one of the great things. But people, of course, are still getting accustomed to this new system. The other piece is there was a lot of back and forth paperwork before, and that always creates possibilities of pieces of paperwork getting lost. That's gone. Everything now is pretty much, except for a couple things that are still mailed, like a birth certificate. Most of the paperwork is done either right within the system or scanned in, so it's automatic. So hopefully that will also cut down on some of the delays and some of the questions about what's going on with the paperwork. But what does take so long, we have to free a child. That can be TPR or that could be relinquishment. We have to make sure the child's placed and that the placement is working out. That placement has to be supervised for at least 6 months to make sure that, again, that's a good placement. Adoption assistance has to be negotiated. That can't happen until the child's actually free and placed. And then there's the whole process with consents and sending paperwork to attorneys and paperwork going back and forth. So it is a process, and I think we're all interested in making it happen as fast as possible. Yes?
Here.
It seems to me like the questions that our board has are regarding cases where all of those things have been done. Mm-hmm. Child's free, adoption assistance has been discussed, been placed the right amount of time, and it still doesn't ever happen. Mm-hmm. And we just go crazy about what in the world is taking so long, and the caseworkers usually say, we don't know, and the attorneys say, we don't know. Nobody knows why it is still languishing.
Well, one of the things that can happen is, as a board, you could make a recommendation at the next review to provide detailed information about what has happened. I know we've had cases where workers have reported that information's not all there, but in reality, or that information is all there, but in reality, some of the pieces are missing. So that's a possibility. To be perfectly honest, without looking at the specific case, I can't tell you exactly what's missing or what it is, what the reasoning is. I think a lot of times workers just don't necessarily, they may have thought all of the pieces were there. They may have thought all of the paperwork's been sent, but it hasn't been. And so I think that, people get really busy, and it can be confusing. And again, that's why we're trying to make it a more clear process. That's part of why I've also handed this out. If you go through it, you have, number one, what has to happen to open the file. So the caseworker has to staff the case with the DA or the AAG, the Assistant Attorney General. And central office, we have to accept it. They have to, of course, get approval to change the plan. They have to complete some work in ORCIDs to talk about the child's adoption and the type of placement. They have to make sure all the paperwork's there, like the birth certificate, the father's questionnaire, ICWA, all of that has to be resolved. And then there's different pieces around recruitment that we've talked about. And then number 3, it talks about proceeding to an adoptive placement selection. Before you can have that placement actually designated is number 4, what's all the paperwork that has to be in. So there's different paperwork, again, around the child summary. Central office, in order to designate a placement, needs to know that the selection has happened. So, for example, if a caseworker made a decision, but they didn't send notification to central office, we have no way to make this the designated placement because we wouldn't necessarily know that the decision has been made. So that communication piece is really important. The child must be free. So we have to get those final court orders that really show that the child's free. If there's been an appeal, we have to get all that paperwork. That comes from the attorney in the court. To begin the adoption assistance process, there's more than just one application from a family. There's information about a child. There's 4E information, which is really around information around the funding piece that people in the branch need to complete. And so that has to be done. And then once the adoption assistance is open, we're notified of who the attorney is, and so we send paperwork to the attorney. Sometimes things can end up at the attorney's office, and so that can take a certain amount of time for them to file the petition and do those different pieces. And then we get consents back. And so there really are different steps, and I can't tell you exactly how long each step takes.
Most of us know these steps.
Okay.
The question is, what is a reasonable amount of time? What is a reasonable amount of time from start to finish? Or what is a reasonable amount of time for each one of these steps? We can read what you've handed out, and I appreciate this. But what is a reasonable amount of time? We're looking at 5 or 6 years for some of our children. That's ridiculous.
Well, and I think what's the thing to take from today, I think, is really read that information, what's on the PowerPoint, with your CRB's field staff, formulate specific questions to ask caseworkers, because oftentimes that's the issue. You just ask, so where are we in the adoption process? You need to be thinking about asking more specific questions. You just heard that TPR finalized. Okay, so what's the next step? Clearly, get at who, what, when. Ask caseworker, what did you do? When did you do it? And then, is that reasonable? So you need to be thinking about formulating specific questions to ask of the caseworkers, because oftentimes they may be new. Maybe they're new to the adoption unit. They may not understand, the adoption process well. So you need to be formulating specific questions. Understand the information that's given there, what's been in the PowerPoint, and work with your CRB field staff on formulating those questions so you understand it, so you know what to ask, not just, general specific questions.
And I guess the other thing I would say, if I can't...
With all due respect,
Mm-hmm.
we are asking specific questions.
Okay.
We are not getting down the line.
Okay. So I can't, I don't know what your specific issues are in your county. I would, again, refer you to your coordinator or your field manager to help figure out what's going on and why you're not getting the information you need. Is 5 or 6 years reasonable? No. It's not reasonable if the child's been freed. Is 5 or 6 years possible? Yes. That can happen in a case where, for some reason, there's been several appeals. You have a really difficult to place child. You haven't been able to, you have a 10-year-old with significant medical issues. That may, although it doesn't seem reasonable, that may happen with a child who's that age, has significant issues, lots of legal issues. Is 24 months reasonable? We would like it to be, but given all of the legal steps, even though that's what we push for, that often doesn't happen. At times we're not even to a point of changing a plan at that point because we've been working with a parent. So as much as I totally hear your frustration, and I get it, I can't tell you exactly what's reasonable because it depends on the case. It's very case specific, and it very much depends on what are the dynamics of the case. And I really encourage you to look at, and it sounds like you're doing a great job. So, I don't know exactly what's happening in your situation, but I really encourage you to look at where is it at in this case and what isn't done. And if there's something not done, that's what needs to be recommended, that get done. There's so many people.
We have time for one more question, and then we need to wrap up given the time constraints.
So mine's kind of a two-part question. The first one is if there's been multiple children in a family who have had termination of parental rights, and a new infant is born, is DHS required to do the relative search again for each child in the family?
So every time a child is placed into care, yes, we do a relative search.
Okay. And the second one is because you can go to termination quicker on each additional child, is there any difference on an infant being in care for 10 months and considering that foster family as the adoptive resource sooner because it's the only person that child's known?
Okay, so let me back up real quick. In terms of an infant and it going faster with each new child, often we have different fathers. I just put that out there because that can really delay a case. You may have a same mother, a different father. In terms of at 10 months an infant and going forward, if you know your plan's adoption and the child's been there for 10 months, we still have to do a relative search. The relatives are still going to have priority placement. Can we go and look at if there's no relatives out there and all you have is a foster parent? Again, you don't have to wait for current caretaker. There's a different route that you can go through, going to a permanency committee and saying, should we just consider this one placement? Yeah. And I just want to say, I really appreciate the time. I know it's frustrating for everybody, and you're sitting on the other end and you're saying, what's going on and what's this black hole? I hear it too. And we're on the other end of it saying, you know, why aren't you sending us this piece of paper, or why does this have to take so long? And so I just think we're all trying to make efforts to try to work together, provide the information, get the information you need, and you're a really great help in that because you can really pay attention to those pieces and make sure that we're moving cases along, because caseworkers are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed with paperwork, and again, here's, you know, we've just shown you the list of a lot of different things that are required to finalize an adoption, and so the more you can help to draw that out, I think the faster a case will move.
And again, I want to encourage you to work with your CRB field staff to formulate the kind of questions that will get you the information you need. Again, being very specific with a timeline, what happened when, what needs to happen next. So I encourage you to work with your CRB field staff on formulating those questions so you get the information you need to make the appropriate findings.
We just, we're out of time. We really want to take a moment to thank Carla Crane. Thank you so much. Great information.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Hopefully you'll all take this information back to your boards and share it with your fellow board members, and we can start moving these cases forward maybe a little quicker with a little better information. Thanks again, Carla.